Welcome back to another edition of the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. I will be joined by a special guest tonight, Rennie Detore, as we talk about AEW and its battle against NXT. Also look forward to WrestleMania season and what's to come in the world of professional wrestling. That's all on this upcoming edition of the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. Welcome back to another edition. I am your host, Sean Meyers, coming to you with a special co-host tonight. It is Rennie Detore back on the podcast, a familiar face. We've had Rennie on a handful of times. His background as a wrestling journalist in the late 90s, early 2000s gives a great perspective to what to expect not only over the next couple of months, but maybe for years to come, as he's pretty in tune with the trends of the wrestling business. Rennie, thank you for taking the time to do this and come back on the podcast.
No problem, Sean. Happy to be here.
So, I know when we talked before, AEW was sort of in its infancy stage, and there was obviously plans being made, but now we've seen it for, about 6 months come to fruition each and every Wednesday, in addition to their pay-per-views, which really was sort of backwards that they started pay-per-views before the TV show, but seems like it's worked out just fine. I know that for a long time, you seemed like the type of person that thought Vince needs competition because the wrestling industry will benefit. Is that fair to say for your assessment and your thoughts on what AEW has been able to provide?
Yeah, I mean, I think it says a lot that Vince really recognized the fact that it exists. A lot of times he thinks he's bigger than wrestling now. He talks about, I compete with Disney, I compete with the NFL. So it was good to see him acknowledge another wrestling company. I think that has a lot to do with the ownership that's involved, with the family that owns the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Khan family. They have some disposable income. They're billionaires, so they can kind of compete on some level. Now, I realize they're not going to go full throttle and sign everybody that they possibly can, which is a good thing. We can probably talk about that more here in a minute. I like that McMahon has to think about the talent that he wants. Guys coming to him now and saying, I want release, I don't want to be here. It sort of pushes him to, hopefully get creative with the people he has on his roster. What it's actually doing at the moment, though, is he's just throwing money after individuals like the Revival or, anybody else. Matt Hardy's trying to, keep guys from going there.
Many of whom that he really doesn't have real plans for, right?
Exactly. So what probably should be like, hey, these guys want to leave. I want to keep them from going because it's really going to force me to be better and be more creative and find something for them to do. But this is more about just keep collecting more people because, again, they can afford to sign guys, to $500,000 contracts or offer them $750,000 a year guaranteed just to keep them away from another company. So it's not really the kind of competition I'd like to see when you look at how things have started to play out initially.
Is there someone that if they jump ship to AEW, it would really actually create the throwback to the Monday Night Wars in a sense?
I really think that guy was CM Punk. He's the one with enough notoriety mainstream that if he were the one to jump to AEW and make that kind of a splash.
In a wrestling role, right?
Yeah, wrestling role. I mean, he could really change the perception of AEW. I like the fact that AEW it's resisted the temptation to sign every single WWE cast-off that exists. I mean, I think Jake Hager was a good pickup. They've talked about, wanting interest in Matt Hardy, Luke Harper. So they're looking at guys that are wanting out and how can they benefit AEW and their roster. So, but if there's one guy, it would have to be Punk. He's probably the only one I can think of at the moment. There's a couple guys that wrestle in New Japan, probably could move the needle a little bit, but they're not as well known in the States. So he's the one. I think Punk would be the one to change the perception of AEW right now. Not that they're doing poorly, but I don't think anybody really sees them as a WWE level to level, apples to apples type product.
Right, because really they're going head to head against NXT. And I think that it's interesting because NXT I thought was really good on the network. And to me, that was a big appeal of WWE Network. They then move it to USA. They then move it to a live show. They then move it to 2 hours. So all these things changing at once. And NXT, sure, I think, has thrived. But this is done solely by Vince McMahon wanting to compete with AEW, right? It's pretty clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think NXT had a good thing on the network. It also made the network seem more important. I understand they run pay-per-views, and that's the only way you can see them now.
Well, but maybe not that long in the future. I don't know if you heard the word about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, funny that you said that. I was going to say, for now, but NXT had a nice little spot carved out on the network. They had NXT UK, so it was a nice little back-to-back, little change of pace. Come to the network, it kind of felt more, less mainstream and thus, of course, more appealing. That's just how things are. In wrestling, ECW became huge because no one could find them on TV. So, when you could actually see it randomly on the Northeast on midnight, you thought it was the greatest thing ever. So that was part of NXT's appeal. But I agree with you. I think the NXT product hasn't suffered a whole heck of a lot with changing to USA, being part of that. But that's Vince McMahon saying, I'm going to put up your brand of wrestling against what we offer. But I don't think that's a Vince thing as much as it is a Triple H thing. I think he understands what NXT is and who it appeals to. And you're starting to see, and it's probably since Survivor Series, that little bit of wanting to kind of have that influx of NXT. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but when I see NXT on WWE programming, it feels fresh to me.
Here's the issue I had, and you mentioned Survivor Series. To me, what they did was they wanted to get NXT basically a push by putting them on Raw and SmackDown so that more people see these people and say, oh, I'm going to watch on Wednesdays. They wanted to grow the Wednesday show. But if you would have said to me a year ago, NXT is going to invade the main roster, I thought it would be this epic thing, and I think it fell well short of that. It wasn't even the same level as the Nexus invasion, or certainly, remember the Lions back almost 20 years ago. That felt special. NXT just really didn't. I wish they would have waited for something more meaningful to actually finally invade the main roster. But now it seems like there's a lot of interaction between the main roster and NXT. And while it necessarily wasn't the interaction we're talking about, NXT took a page out of the main roster's book just last night. They had a standalone Sunday night pay-per-view. I did not watch it because I'm behind on NXT, and I'm sort of, a little bizarre about that. I want to watch it sequentially. But it seems like this was a big step. I don't know if it's going to be a regular thing. Probably not. But what does this mean maybe going forward for that brand?
Well, as far as being a regular thing, the takeovers, of course, have always been the Saturday lead into a main WWE pay-per-view. So this was their first standalone that they did on a Sunday night. And there is an NXT UK pay-per-view that's coming, I believe, in April. And the NXT UK pay-per-view is also going to be on Sunday night as well. So I think they're trying to see if NXT can carry that, I guess, primetime pay-per-view night on Sunday as its own brand, which I like. I mean, NXT can't be consistently viewed as, the lesser version of the WWE, because I think a lot of people, when you watch the product, I did watch last night's show. And again, those shows are such a complete 180 from what you see on Raw, right, and especially on SmackDown, that, it's a good niche for the WWE to have that. And we can talk more about, NXT specifically, the product, but, it's a good change of pace for the WWE. Last night's show was really good. Some of it, I think, pardon me?
Anything stand out from last night in particular to you?
Boy, I'll tell you, it's always the work rate that the guys in the crowd, I think that just really comes alive when you watch those shows. The crowd is on every single move, every single spot. You see, consistently 20-minute matches that don't feel too long. They're booked well. Sometimes they're overbooked a little bit with the near falls at the end.
Right.
Not that I'm complaining necessarily, because if you ask me to choose between the NXT product as it stands now and what WWE looks like on the main roster, I choose NXT 10 times out of 10. That being said, and AEW is guilty of this as well, the high spots, the no selling, the near falls, which are good. It's a little
in moderation,
across a little bit of overkill. Particularly, like you look at, some of the matches last night, guys just get blasted with. And again, we're talking about a performance where you have to sell being hurt or sell a move.
Adam Cole seems like he no-sells every single time he's in a big match, right?
Well, he and Ciampa had a phenomenal match. It clearly was great. But when you start watching it depends on what kind of fan you are. Okay, so you either like the idea that, the people always refer to this as like the All Japan, this is back way dating myself, I'm sure, where you got to hit a guy 17 times with your finisher and then you beat him with a clothesline. So that's kind of where this came from for me as a fan, and then as a journalist. So I appreciate what they're doing, but I see sometimes where, last night Ciampa and Cole, no selling their finishers, their moveset, and then Ciampa gets beat with a belt shot. So, like I said, you either like that kind of match, how it's laid out, because it is exciting, it's intense, it's realistic to a point with how stiff it is. The finishes, though, you either love or you hate them. I don't mind them, but they do, if I'm being nitpicky, I guess, they do grate on me a little bit as far as, guys getting hit, 17 super kicks and the guy kicks out, he takes a belt shot, and that's it. So, again, to me, it's nitpicking, but they got to pull back a little bit once in a while. Like, if I'm not trying to be Jim Cornette where I say, like, you have to sell every fist drop that's ever been delivered. If somebody hits you with a knee drop, you need to pretend like you got your eye blown out. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. That's antiquated, but this is overblown sometimes.
So I love that you brought Jim Cornette into it. I was going to ask you, Dave Meltzer is very polarizing. He, however, does have a background that really is almost unparalleled when it comes to covering professional wrestling.
Okay.
He is very much like, this is what people said about wrestlers in the 80s when they were clinging to the styles of the 60s and 70s, and this is what people said about Shawn Michaels in the early 90s. And so he thinks this is going to become the norm, and people who complain about it are just going to be the get off my lawn type people. But here's what I'll say. You brought up the point of, like, if you wanted to appeal to everyone, then I think what this type of style is it appeals to a niche crowd, right? The ratings show that AEW and NXT are pulling the hardcore wrestling fans, but they're not appealing to a wide audience, which, when I think wrestling was at its best, had a massively wide audience that, quite frankly, this style of wrestling, at least in North America, doesn't seem to have as wide of an appeal to.
Yeah, I would agree. And the thing is, when you watch NXT and you watch the main roster, okay, obviously you and I can just, from the eye test for 20 minutes, can see, you'd think that NXT and WWE are run by two completely different companies.
Right.
And I get it. Like, you people sell Coca-Cola to the masses, but hey, maybe somebody wants coconut water. I get it. Like, that's part of the appeal. You're vast in your brain. You're diverse. So, but the problem, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, the problem with it for me is you get guys that work like that in NXT, and then all of a sudden it's WrestleMania the day after, and we have Keith Lee, probably not the best example. Let's go with Adam Cole. He comes up to the main roster. Is he going to have 27, 30-minute matches on pay-per-views, on TV?
What's he going to do when he goes against Braun Strowman?
Yeah, so he can translate on the mic, and he can do his promos, and he can be that, the heel that's afraid of you and wants to cheat. Like, I love it. I love what he does. But is he going to translate on the main roster when it comes to against guys that maybe don't match up well with him? Maybe. And again, it's nitpicking, but I think that's why you see a lot of failed moves from NXT to the main roster. Now, funny enough, you look at a guy, and I'm going to use Elias as an example, okay? Wildly over on the main roster, very underutilized at this point in his career. I'm not sure why he comes out and gets beat and consistently. I'm not sure why they can't figure out what to do with him, but that's not what we're talking about. He was a guy in NXT, probably didn't necessarily fit down there like it is now or was, but on the main roster, he translated as getting over with a different style that complements more of being on Raw or SmackDown.
I think Alexa Bliss would be a good female example of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so guys that aren't successful in NXT, when they come to the main roster, tend to have a little more success because, Elias has the look, the size, all the things that they want. So there's a reason why. I don't have the numbers, and nor am I going to figure it out on the top of my head, but if you take the last 10 guys that have come up from NXT, how many of them are still viable? I mean, Let's be honest. It doesn't really, they're,
and you're talking like NXT World Champions who haven't really done that much. I mean, Robert Roode was a champion. Shinsuke Nakamura was a champion.
You can look at Joe, had a cup of coffee with Brock Lesnar in one main event match. It hasn't been anything since. Rollins, he was a proven commodity before he got to NXT to a point. You could roll down through a lot, but that's why when I sit and watch NXT, whether I'm watching it with a friend or just watching it in general, I look at guys like Keith Lee and Adam Cole and Tommaso Ciampa and Gargano, and I'm like, please be careful about moving them because.
Well, do you think with NXT being really its own brand, and I know they've been saying that for years, but it really does feel different now because it's getting equal time on cable TV to SmackDown and just an hour behind Raw. Are we going to see more of these are NXT guys and they generally stay NXT guys if we don't think Vince is going to have a big role for them?
I think so, and I think I don't know the dynamic between Vince McMahon and Triple H, and people tend to label McMahon as the antiquated one who doesn't really know what's popular or what people want to see, and I tend to agree with that when you watch the shows. That's just, again, eye test.
I would agree with that too, but he also, I think, again, he's appealing to beyond what AEW or NXT appeals to. So he's going in a different approach, but I think he could be doing a heck of a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at, he's probably, the ship has sailed on his creative juices years ago. Okay, so, but I think Triple H, if he's truly the person behind NXT, I think he's the type of guy that thinks that this can just be its own viable thing. But again, I go back to, you look at WrestleMania, Shayna Baszler, Rhea Ripley, like they're starting to move people from that brand and infusing them into the main roster. Now, I don't know if it's just going to be a one-off, like where they're there and then they leave, they go back, but it can truly stand alone as its own and make it what it is. But it depends on what kind of fan you are. Like a lot of people long for NXT and being that way on the main roster. Guess what? Not going to happen. It just isn't, because they probably feel like, hey, look, we get 800,000 people to 900,000 people to watch NXT on Wednesdays. We're bringing people in that like the product. We're still getting 2.5, give or take, million people on Monday, 2.5, give or take, on Friday. They're okay with that number. The networks are okay with that number. So they're going to try to make it different, and people are just going to have to deal with it. I mean, that's just where we are with it. Maybe when Vince isn't with us anymore, things will change a little bit. I don't know.
Well, do you think eventually Triple H takes over controlling what Vince is currently controlling?
I mean, it seems logical. I mean, I really don't see anybody else in a succession plan that, is young enough and understands.
Well, the thing is, Triple H might be in his mid-60s by the time this happens. If Vince keeps clinging on,
I mean, what Triple H is, 50, 51-ish,
right,
give or take. What's McMahon, like 106? I mean, he's got a few years left, I guess. But, again, he's the logical choice. I mean, Stephanie, I don't know what her, business acumen or writing acumen is. I think
Stephanie's very involved, but I don't think it would be her, like, coming up with the TV stuff and the creative stuff as much as more. She's more probably the business side, I would think, right?
Let's hope. I mean, and I'm saying that in the best way possible, but not really. Like she's had her, she's dipped her toe in the creative water enough that I'm good with what I've been told and what I've seen from her when she's in that role. I think Triple H is probably the guy. I know that, like Shawn Michaels has some involvement in NXT. Get some guys involved that, kind of understand that wrestling is supposed to be organic. You're supposed to find talent and let them foster in an environment where they can just be themselves with a twist.
Which is what I think AEW has been trying to do.
Sure. Not everything has to be so canned. I think you and I know we've watched wrestling enough that the 80s was a different animal, altogether. But when you look at what was popular in the the late 90s, the Attitude stuff, like that was just feeding off of, who these guys were. I mean, again, if you look at The Rock, you look at Rocky Maivia, and you look at what he became, if he would have been Rocky Maivia now, I don't think The Rock ever comes out,
right?
Because I don't think they have the wherewithal to understand that when you have somebody and what they're doing isn't working, they don't know how to fix it anymore.
It seems like Kevin Owens could sort of be close to what The Rock was in terms of becoming this massive character, but they just never fully invest and give him that opportunity.
Yeah, they got to commit to him. I mean, Kevin Owens is wildly over. He comes out, people identify with him. He doesn't have the best build. Like, people are like, oh, that guy could be in my pool league. I don't know, whatever.
Which is Dusty Rhodes in the 1970s.
Sure. And it's so easy sometimes to see when they just want to latch on to someone. But again, you got to be consistent with it. It's too all over the place. And I'm not here to just rain down on WWE's product, but hey, I've watched SmackDown in bits and pieces.
I think the last 3 or 4 months of SmackDown have been really bad. And I actually think Raw is slightly refreshing because they're really more about some unproven guys. I think they got handed a roster of like Castaway, 205 Live guys, and Paul Heyman. I don't know how much he really has control over it, but he's like, hey, we're going to use Angel Garza and Humberto Carrillo and Andrade and some of these guys. Now, some of it's still ridiculous with, Bobby Lashley and Rusev and Lana and all that, but I think they are using some unproven guys, and it's a little bit more, I would say it feels like SmackDown from the early 2000s, much more than SmackDown now feels like it.
Yeah, I mean, SmackDown right now being on a major network, I think they're trying to make it too much like a sitcom. Like, I mean, listen, I'm all about certain wrestling storylines have perpetuated for years, fat guy in tag team likes the woman, or, guy comes out, and cuts his promo because he's got a scepter and a crown on. But it's so old. It's so tiresome. Look, Baron Corbin, when he was in NXT, again, another good example, they probably think he's done light years better than what he was there. But he's one of those guys, like, he comes out and it's like whenever I would hear like X-Pac or Big Boss Man's music hit, like I just want to, I'm not angry because he's a good heel. I'm angry because he's on my TV.
You don't want to see him, right?
It's like go away type anger. And
agreed.
Again, so, but there's a guy that I think had potential and they conformed him to be something on the main roster that's completely outdated. It's not the type of, it doesn't make me want to watch.
And it feels like that's way more on SmackDown than Raw right now, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, SmackDown is again, I know that it gets 2.5 million viewers probably out of habit. But it is
because there's people like me who just watch every week because it's almost to the point now where I feel like, oh, I have to watch it because I've always watched it. But there's part of me that says like, oh man, I'm going to be basically watching SmackDown while I'm looking up other stuff and not paying full attention to it.
Sure. And when you can go and watch 17 minutes of highlights for a 2-hour show on YouTube the next day where somebody literally just chops it up in their basement somehow and puts it out and it's like, oh, I'm good. But I don't see anything else. So again, it's just the kind of show that that you can afford to miss.
Excuse me. We talked very briefly about Dave Meltzer and Jim Cornette and whatnot. What is the future of wrestling 5, 10, 15 years from now? What's it going to look like? What will a typical match be like? And how much different might a program be than what we're seeing right now? Or do you think it's pretty similar?
That's a great question. I don't know, again, because you're so mired in this slump that they're in on the main roster. I think AEW, New Japan, NXT, I think that truly is probably the direction you'll see it go, good or bad, where it's more maybe athletically driven and underscored with some creativity, but not overkill, not where it's so campy that it's like hurts to watch. I think I see it going that direction because I think we talked about it earlier. I think a guy like Triple H understands that, you can have certain elements of old school wrestling and selling move sets and doing injury angles, but you can do it in a way that's kind of more new age or
it's
more
not insulting to the vast majority of your fans.
Exactly. Again, I think Jim Cornette, I like him. I think it's hilarious when he makes fun of Kenny Omega. I'm sorry. I know everybody loves Kenny Omega and, he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I get it, but it's funny to me because somewhere deeply rooted in that very angry, older wrestling, historian, he makes some good points if you can get through the babble.
Right.
Hey, you just, hit this guy with a drop kick from the top of a cage. He flipped over backwards, landed on his head on concrete, and then 7 seconds later, he's doing a cartwheel. So he makes good points. It's just, you got to find a medium where wrestling, where I think is going to go, finding that balance between the athleticism that inevitably gets better. You see it in football. Guys just get faster. They get stronger. They're better conditioned. I don't think anybody thought Dino Bravo was going to do a hurricane anytime soon. So
at some point, football changed from like a smash mouth, grinded out type of game to a wide open offense. And it seems like this is the wrestling equivalent with this NXT and AEW.
Yeah, and you'll still see little glimpses, using the NFL analogy where you'll still see some big hits, but nobody gets really hurt. Nobody targets anymore. So they'll find a way to take this, ping-ponging around in these high spots that are, consistent and somewhat can be, like I said, overkill. They'll find a happy medium. But right now it's kind of in a state of influx where, you have stories and things that are written that are very campy, very insulting to intelligence of fans. But then you have the athletic part where, I think that's where it's going to go. But just with a little sprinkling of, telling stories that people can relate to. Again, I watch a little bit of New Japan. It's more of a sport. But I would
love, the rumor was SmackDown was going to be more sports based. And I think AEW with their records has tried to do that. I would be okay with that as long as it's still entertaining and you have characters and storylines. But I think that would be a good move for WWE to sort of drift a little bit more that direction.
I think AEW gets a lot of that from New Japan, where New Japan will run a tournament that'll run across 3 days.
Right.
And then they'll have different bracketing where it's okay, well, this guy's in the A bracket, but he loses, then he drops to the C bracket.
Where winning legitimately really determines if you're a contender or not. Not
correct.
Bill Goldberg wants to come back so he gets a world title match because he said he wants one.
Right. So the New Japan model is what AEW is kind of flirting with a little bit. And I think the reason the New Japan model works is because, yes, it's more sport-oriented, but they also have backstory that they tell. Hey, when a guy comes back from an injury there after 9 months and they're literally keep him off TV, because that's what you're supposed to do, the impact that you have is so much greater. It's hey, quarterback A tore his Achilles, but he was able to come back for the first playoff game. And it's as a fan, you're just whoa, that's awesome. I've been waiting. So they know how to do it. They know how to pace it. And it's not just match, and nothing to tell. They find a way to tell a story that actually, as an adult who's, I'm showing my age, who's 40 years old, who's watched wrestling for, 35 years.
Did you start in the mid 80s?
What's that? Yeah.
Okay,
80,
so I thought about this recently. Correct me if I'm wrong. Probably the majority of fans, if maybe not the majority, at least I would say 30 to 40%, believed wrestling was real back in the 80s.
Sure. Absolutely.
You can see it in the fans' expressions when they go to shows. And by the way, there was like, if you look at them, look at the crowd from like WrestleMania 1 compared to fans now, it's completely contrast. People are like dressed up and everything. Is that why wrestling has to be so much different now? Because no fans above the age of 8 believe wrestling, whereas back then you had to make it seem very realistic because fans thought it was real.
You know, I think the way it was, you know, in the mid 80s where people still weren't sure if it was scripted or real or, you know, so on and so forth. I think, you know, it's just people looked at it and it hadn't really yet, you know, gotten past that 60s and 70s where people would go and, you know, it felt more like a boxing feel to it. And it kind of still, you know, Vince kind of took it and made it more, you know, spectacle than sport. And then it's just kind of continued to, depending on your perspective, grow into something that's more entertainment based. So I don't think it necessarily has to be like that now, but you can't present a product where, you know, okay, guys are winning and losing, and, you know, it really goes again back to the type of fan you are. Like, as a fan, like, I like the idea of like, hey, this guy won, this guy lost. I know in the back of my mind that like it's all predetermined and like, you know, this guy being 4-0 is only because somebody said it was a good idea. Like, but again, I suspend my, you know, logical part of my brain that says, hey, it's not real. And I can enjoy the sport element of it. And I think that's probably where we're not seeing much of it like that anymore. I think you can be that way because, look, everybody knows that they know who's going to win and lose, but it's between in your mind knowing somebody decided this here and I'm going to get to here, and we both know that each side understands what's going to happen, but how you present it, you know, hey, I just watched the newest Rambo movie. Look, he's you know, a broken down guy from, you know, wartime, and I know at the end there's going to be a lot of dead bodies. And I was right, but the middle still was it's what I thought it would be, and, you know, that's why I watched it. I knew what the ending was going to be,
right?
But I still watched it because keep me in the middle, keep my attention in the middle. Tell me the story that I want to hear.
It's WrestleMania season, Royal Rumble. About 3 weeks removed from that, they head next 6 weeks or so towards WrestleMania, and I long for the days of WrestleMania, or excuse me, Royal Rumble. And then a pretty direct path to WrestleMania, not all these detours, as they'll call it, with the show in Saudi Arabia, and then they always have an elimination chamber, and sometimes they have 2 pay-per-views, all these things. But nonetheless, we have a pretty decent idea of what's to come at WrestleMania. Drew McIntyre, he wins the Royal Rumble on the men's side, and Charlotte, for whatever reason, they felt the need that she needed to win the Royal Rumble.
Right.
We have a pretty good idea that, you know, it's obviously already set for those matches. And then is it going to be Bray Wyatt? Is it going to be Goldberg? Someone's probably going against Roman Reigns out of that group. I'm thinking it's going to be Wyatt against Roman. But yeah. WrestleMania, is it just so established that no matter what the card is, people are going to watch and care about it at this point?
So I'm going to say yes and no. And I'm not giving you a wishy-washy answer. I'll explain here in a second. So I think WrestleMania is, you know, like the Super Bowl in the sense that the live crowd, and when they announce where it's going to be, like, hey, it's going to be in Tampa next year, people are going to go because it's just that type of an event. So to that question, I say yes, WrestleMania is coming to your town. I want to buy tickets. It's going to sell out. You know, that's just the way it's going to be. As far as watching it goes, I think there's always going to be, Sean, 1 or 2 matches that they throw at you that's going to be enough to make you want to watch.
Is Brock Lesnar, Drew McIntyre going to be one of those matches for you?
So for me, that match I want to see. Okay,
are you behind McIntyre right now? Because they've got me invested in him since he's kind of become more of a character.
Yeah, finally they've landed the plane and they understand what they have, and, you know, we'll see what they do, you know, is how the match goes. But that's intriguing to me because McIntyre seems fresh. Like, people want to see him do well. He's a great talent, great babyface.
It's so funny because like he wasn't pushed that heavily up until like maybe a month before the Royal Rumble. It wasn't like something where people got sick of him because they've been pushing him so heavily for such a long time and forcing him on people.
Well, you just answered your own question, because when people can rally behind somebody that they want to see or they know that deserves to be there, when they finally get it, it's intriguing. So again, you can talk about SmackDown being, awful and Raw being just, hit or miss. I do agree with you. They've infused some young guys and some different talent that make it watchable. But the McIntyre push, with Lesnar, they set it up really well at the Rumble. You mentioned the Royal Rumble, like with, McIntyre tossing him out, Lesnar just steamrolled everybody. So that's when the rare glimpse, so for anybody listening right now, if you want a rare glimpse of WWE understanding how to do this business, watch the Rumble. Not that they need to establish Lesnar.
That was the weird thing. I felt like it worked perfectly, but I was also like, was it necessary? But I guess if it works perfectly, you just say, okay, well, it was worth it. My question was, why did you have to job out 14 or so guys to Lesnar, because he's already so freaking established?
So I had the same thought that you did when I watched it. I'm like, really? Like, the guy is already, people are already.
That's like Charlotte winning the Rumble. So unnecessary, right?
Yeah, Lesnar has that credibility. It's never going to go anywhere. I don't care how many times he loses to Seth Rollins, or gets accidentally pinned by Mysterio. Like, he's still going to be that guy where the music hits, it's like, oh, geez, this is something I need to be, paying attention to. That being said, I thought the same thing when I watched it. I was like, man, they're really just throwing these dudes under the bus for the sake of doing it. But then I stopped and I watched it play out, and then I saw the next night, and I'm watching McIntyre, and I'm going to go back to my original point. If you want to see a rare glimpse of the WWE doing something that is impactful, yes, there were 14 guys, some of which didn't deserve to be, tossed aside. I think John Morrison, Elias, there was some talent that they kind of just blew off.
Right.
But
collateral damage.
Look, I'm going to sell my main course. So if Lesnar looks dominant in the Rumble and McIntyre is the guy that tosses him out and then wins, and that's the important part. I've seen them do that before, where a guy like McIntyre will throw Lesnar out, then he loses.
Right. I thought that was McIntyre's moment, was eliminating Lesnar. There's your match, and then you get someone like Roman setting up the SmackDown title.
And they backdoor their way into having this title match, but they made McIntyre do the deed and throw Lesnar out, and he wins. And so now it's like they followed through, very important word for them, which they don't do often. They follow through, McIntyre wins, and now that match is like, man, Lesnar was dominating, and that one guy, that said, I tossed him out, and I have his, it's an old story, but it still works, and it always will. I have your number, and I'm invested in it, and I want to see how it plays out, So again, WrestleMania, to answer your original question, they always do enough at this point to get me to say, look, there's 2 or 3 matches on the card that I want to see. There's enough intrigue. Do they need to make it 17 hours long? Absolutely not. There does not need to be a pre-show that starts at 4 o'clock when the show starts at 7. There's a lot of problems.
Absolute maximum for me would be 6 to 11:30. I would probably trim it from 6 to 11. And I'm saying 6, meaning that's when the pre-show starts. It was 5 until 12:30 last year. 6 to 11, I think, would be good.
Listen, we all have places to be on Monday morning. I can't watch WrestleMania till almost 1 o'clock in the morning, and it's just so. Again, WrestleMania has the name value. People assume even the most, disingenuous fan or defeated fan will watch WrestleMania because they still feel like they'll see something special. So I still think it's a draw to a point. But again, you can only bring back John Cena so many times, just the way you can only bring back Hogan so many times, just the way you can only bring back...
Well, you can bring him back all the time once you go to Saudi Arabia, I guess. So there's always that silver lining.
Yeah, I mean, but WrestleMania will always be a draw locally where it is. That's never going to be an issue. But again, it's always about building more talent, building reasons to watch, and adding intrigue. So again, Charlotte Flair didn't have to win the Rumble. Thought it was overkill. Having said that, I like the matchup with Flair and Ripley. It's going to be different. Okay, so right now we'll take different over, hey, Becky Lynch versus Charlotte Flair. I honestly would rather dive out the window that's right in front of me right here than see them wrestle for the 700th time. So, again, there's some good stuff that they have going now. You mentioned Wyatt and Reigns. Yuck. No, I get the idea that no one's been able to stop him, but nobody wants to see Reigns do that anyway. Cena versus take your pick. I've heard Goldberg, Elias. I've heard Undertaker versus Styles, which, again, just please no.
Right.
I mean, there's only so many times I can watch him leave his hat and coat in the ring before I'm like, I'm not buying it. So it's only happened 6 times. So, but we'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
Rennie, as always, I appreciate it. I was mentioning to you before we went on the air, tweeted out today that WrestleMania I'll be going to, and the week of WrestleMania will be the 2-year anniversary of this show. It'll be the final episode of this show because Justin and I have had just a brutal time trying to get together to do this. Our schedules have changed. He has a small child now, so a lot has changed, but I still enjoy doing this show. Wanted to get you on at least one last time to talk about this, and I know over the next 6 weeks or so I'm going to try to have as many special guests as possible. Want to give you a quick plug. If anyone wants to follow you, they can do so. Rennie Detore 17. Again, I always enjoy talking to you, and your insight was much appreciated. You can follow us on Twitter, 5-Star Pod Wrestle, Instagram, 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and even after we close the show for the final time, we're going to keep the YouTube channel. You can go back and watch all your favorite episodes and reminisce about the better days. But for now, we're going to put a bow on this one. I want to thank my special co-host today, Rennie Detore. This is Sean Meyers. We'll catch you again next week here on the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling.